And on stage, please, if Natalia Andreenko can also join us, the coordinator of Energy and Climate Projects IPO Eco Partnerships. And we will welcome two more speakers, Irina Ilyina, Director of the Institute for Regional Studies and Urban Planning at the Higher School of Economics, who will join us later. Timur Idrisov, Senior Advisor for Ecological Organization Malenka Zemlya, Tajikistan. And also later, due to logistical issues, Ulf Andersson, Innovation and Sustainable Development Expert, Swedish Environment Protection Agency, will also join us on stage. So welcome everyone. Just to present myself, although you might have all had to listen to me this morning, I'm Jana Davidova, the Deadline 2020 Project Manager from C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group. And we are here today to hear from our interesting speakers, but also get input from you in the audience, hear hopefully a lot of interesting questions. Please do challenge our speakers. And we will try an exercise during this session that hopefully will lead to some concrete outcomes. We've got here a flip chart where we will try and note some of the recommendations from the speakers and the audience for how to better collaborate with cities and among cities to help them reach climate neutrality and battle against climate change. So with no further ado, let me invite the first speaker, and then please do start preparing your questions as they speak. So Stefan Nystrom, please.
Thank you so much. Let's see if the power presentation works. This is going to be an exercise with 15 pictures in 5 minutes, so I'll try and cut it into half. Let's see if that's the one. No, that's not the one really. That's Ulf Andersson's, and I wouldn't want to steal his, you know. That'd be boring. Let's see if we have another one, starting with a globe and lots of charts of where we were at from 1950 and onwards, and how much fossil fuels we used and where we are at in times of climate change. Do we have any presentation down there, perhaps, which looks like that, with my name on it? If not, I suggest we change order of speakers, if I may be so bold.
Let's do that, if that's okay. Let's work with the logistics we have. If I could ask Ulf Andersson to start our presentation instead. Luckily, we've got the two speakers from similar backgrounds, so it will not change the order of the session too much. But thank you so much for your flexibility.
Oh, thanks a lot. I will make a very brief presentation and reducing my planned presentation for a quarter of an hour to 4 minutes. So stay with me if I may seem a bit confused. So I would like to have the presentation, please. Hi guys, could I have this presentation back, please?
Great. I suggest while our technical team works on getting the presentation up again, let's start the session by actually making sure we know who's in the audience again. So while the team is working on this, thank you team. Could we get a... Oh, there we go. Okay, perfect.
So, thank you. I would like to say a few words on one of the main topic I think would be a theme for cooperation between cities and between countries, and that is a sustained and deliberated exchange of best practices. That's my general theme. And we have talked lots on why cities are important and what the Swedish EPA does. I won't go into this in more detail, only just to state that environmental technologies and innovations for sustainability is actually a policy-driven market, policy-driven arena, strongly dependent on political goals and legislation. And we also have to see what actually are we to be exchanging. Best practices could be a lot of things. Of course, it could be new technologies, materials and processes, but it also could be whole buildings. It could be ways of using nature. It, of course, could also be intellectual tools, like using LCA and all other kind of tools in environmental and sustainability work. And there is also a special kind of innovations where you make combinations of existing technologies, systems or functions, and make them then interact in a broader context. For instance, when utilizing waste heat or building up the chain for the production of biogas. And of course, you can have new thinking and innovation also in the way of governance, what we call eco-governance. And from a Swedish perspective, directed towards Russia, but also towards other countries. So we see these areas that are important for Russian cities, and in fact, most of the cities in the world. But areas where Sweden has a long experience and a technical competence, and that is smart climate adaptation, reuse of all kind of resource flows within cities, like waste heat or wastewater or waste in general. And also, as we have been speaking about earlier, carbon-free public transportation. And just to give you a few examples of what this actually means in practice, and there are lots and lots of more examples, but since the time has been reduced, so to speak, I will just give you a few. Starting with smart climate adaptation, we can use nature in new ways and make nature and make parks and stuff like that in new areas in the city. Here you can see that a small park is made in a low level of the city. So when there are intensive rain or floods, you can actually fill this area, enjoy the park when it's not filled, but still use the function. And the vegetation and the soil itself will actually be a kind of hydrological break. Another example is district cooling. I mean, the concept that is very similar to district heating, but instead of heating, you have cold water that you can use to cool the city. And if you have a system where you access cold water from some natural source, you get free cooling. Oh, well, not totally free, but you get very cheap cooling. And the city of Stockholm is the largest promoter or practice of this in the world. Actually, there is 250,000 meters of a citywide district cooling system in the city of Stockholm. So you can use just heat exchangers instead of traditional AC conditioners within the buildings. Now going to smart use of resources. This is, let's say, the world's most water-efficient shower. Actually, there's an invention, a Swedish invention, and a Swedish company, stolen from the United States, to be frank, but still something that you can use just 5 liters of water that give this similar effect as if you use 75 liters of water. And that means you save not only water, but you save energy. And if you calculate how much you can save, you can go to the homepage of this company and see what you will save in various cities in the world, depending on the price of water and the price of energy. And this is, let's say, a rather small example. Actually, this is quite a good beer produced from wastewater, just to show it is possible and as a driver for purification technology. Cities produce lots of heat, and data centers are producing more and more heat. We should utilize this better. And the city of Stockholm is actually doing this by making agreements between private business and the city to do that. And my very last slide is biogas buses. And the advantage of using biogas is that we always will produce biogas because we always will have organic waste. And if you have transportation systems or energy system based on natural gas, you could easily substitute biogas instead of natural gas. And that has, no, the very last example. If you need electric cars, you need an electric infrastructure, which recently. So, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ulf. And if you would like to take a seat, I've already spotted a couple potential questions there. Especially interesting is the example on the waste heat that could be particularly relevant for Moscow, because Moscow has a very large district energy system. So let's wait for the questions and answers session, but let's hear more about that. And to continue the introductions, I'd like to invite Vladimir Lenev now to give his short remarks on some of the UNEP programs and the key components of green cities, and hopefully some recommendations on collaboration around that.
Спасибо, Яна.
Thank you, Yana. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of the Second Climate Forum of Cities. It is a fundamental initiative. It is vital to meet together to work out solutions for particular identified problems. I would like to thank the Department of Natural Resources of the City of Moscow. The elections of the mayor means that the city administration focuses on environmental, climate change and environmental protection issues. I would like to thank my speakers, my colleagues taking part in this session. I believe that two major projects that unite urban and environmental issues are already in place. I mean United Nations Environmental Programme and United Nations Housing Programme Habitat, UN Habitat. Its headquarters is located in Nairobi, which is the fourth capital of the United Nations. So the first is in New York, then Geneva, Vienna, and finally Nairobi. It is for a good reason that the global community chooses as a location for these two programs in one city, because environmental and urban issues are inextricably linked together. If we manage to solve environmental problems without solving urban challenges, we won't be able to have a complete solution. Our main task is to collect data and information on the global status of environment and those innovative and energy-saving models in its development. Moscow is not the only city to be a model of cutting-edge, eco-benign technologies. Cities are to exchange views and best practices to learn from each other. Here is another example coming from Bangkok. The construction of any skyscraper is strictly regulated. There must be a few stories dedicated to parking lots. Unfortunately, this is not the case in Moscow, but this initiative would be very popular because citizens of high buildings always need parking lots. In Istanbul, there was an initiative on public transportation. Let us have a look at the metro in Paris. it always takes you no more than 15 minutes to walk from one station to another. It means that passengers do not need to change means of transport. They can go from one point to another without changing the means of transport they had chosen. National and federal authorities are to be engaged in order to take those legislation which would be instrumental so that this legislation would be implemented. They need also to encourage responsible corporations
that are also working in line with the environmentally friendly standard, and maybe punish those that are not willing to work in line with the environmental standard. To conclude, I'd like to say that people, Homo sapiens as we are now, we've been living in the cities for so many years now, and it's our major target to actually make our urban settlements as comfortable and as environmentally friendly as possible. And we need to work all together on that. We cannot compromise on some minor settlements. So some of the European countries are known for their very prominent climate-friendly legislation, but while cleaning out their own cities, they are relocating their heavy industries into the emerging markets, which basically means more polluted Asian cities. So globally speaking and nature-wise speaking, it's not a solution, it's just a geographical reallocation of the problem. So all those problems that we're facing, all those environment-related, climate-related problems should be solved all together with the joint efforts of the Habitat program and all together. So next session is going to cover the technological solutions with regard to the climate and environment protection. I very much hope that our distinguished guests will participate in that. I believe that legislation and should be based on the technological solutions, just like the switch to the cell phones. So before, we used to have so many copper telephone lines. We were all like covered in those. And now switching to the cellular phones, Africa, as a matter of fact, does not need to go into this transition period from copper lines ensuring telephone liaison. They are now using cellular phones. So, say in Paris, it was some time ago talked about a lot the utilization and recovery of manure. Now it's not the problem anymore. So all of these problems that we're facing right now, we need to find solutions for those, and we need them to be comprehensively green.
Again, there are so many points you raised, especially the one about the risk of just relocating emissions and solving the problem in one city, but then what happens across the globe in another country or in another city, and that without a global solution, coordination, it's very hard to. Local cities can take action, but if it's a coordinated effort, collaboration on a global scale, then of course that's the right way to do it, and it's much more efficient. So thank you so much. I've noted a couple of questions as well. I'm sure audience will have some ready, but before we open up for the first round of questions, just in a minute, I'd love to now invite to give her short remarks Natalia Andreenko, who will share with us some of her experiences with the Covenant of Mayors and the way that the Covenant has been working in the Republic of Belarus.
Спасибо большое. Я прошу включить.
Well, thank you very much. And if it's possible, I'd like to have my PowerPoint on the screen. So I come from the Eco Partnership. That's an NGO in the Republic of Belarus. I will just briefly walk you through what our initiative of the Mayor Agreement is about. That's a huge international initiative that unites more than 7,000 cities and towns towns in 53 countries where we have over 53 million people living there, residents. So the idea behind it is for municipality to decrease the greenhouse emissions and to adapt to the climate change that we have right now. For the Eastern Partnership, the liability is 30% by 2030. In European countries, they are aiming at decreasing their greenhouse gas emission by 40% by 2030. So the way it works, I'm just going to briefly walk you through this so just to have an idea what it is. So it's a systematic work that we have in a city or a town. There is a working group being established where we have people from various areas in life, that be emergency services, that be economists, that be tutors, educators, that be scientific community. So it's a working group that really unites all those different areas of professional life that rarely meet together. So this working group does analytics for the situation. They create a register on the greenhouse gas emissions, and they work in line with the Paris Agreement, and they assess the climate risks that are those in the top priorities to be tackled for this settlement, for this town or cities. Then they work out an action plan by 2030, and it involves also a range of events or actions that are supposed to be unrolled on a systematic scale. Then a city also prepares a report with regard to their results. Then there is a support structure, the support of that agreement, and it is there to help our mayors and other stakeholders how to create this registry, then do the assessment. They help with sourcing financing and grants for separate events. Then there is a huge deal of information and experience exchange that's happening. Then an action plan has two parts to it. There is an energy part and a climate part. When it comes to the energy, then it involves a range of events that are aimed at increased energy efficiency, both in the housing sector, in the education sector, in the city managed, facilities, and transportation included. And the city can include waste management there, and industrial facilities, and business community. If the business community is willing to participate, should be willing to participate. Then when it comes to the adjustment to the climate change, then it touches upon so many aspects. Then we work with the spatial planning, green landscape, and we've just listened to WHO talking to us about how climate change affects people's health. So in the Republic of Belarus, we have 41 cities participating in these mayor's initiatives, and it's only 12 who developed their action plan by 2020 or by 2030. They all have their individual time scale. Say those who joined in 2016, they first elaborated their plan by 2020. You can see that these are relatively small towns. When it comes to C40 is all about working with bigger metropolitan areas. Then we work with smaller towns, even included those that only have up to 5,000 residents. Just to give you a few examples, there are several projects that have been delivered successfully in Belarus. Our pioneering town is the town of Polotsk. That was the first one to deliver projects on revamping the city lighting. We have diode lamps. They've revamped their transportation network. They facilitate their residents swapping from their cars to using public transport. Then they're leading in the renewable energy sources. We now have around 7,600 megawatts of renewable energy power stations, wind power plants, and all of them are installed with the help of the business community. Then we also have an action plan that deals with the climate neutrality goal. We have very small towns working on this. Say the town of Chelsea, they are so proactive and they are so proactive with their initiatives, so they are delivering a lot of projects. They have smart systems when it comes to energy and water metering and other technologies employed. So up until now, we've been primarily focused within this initiative on the energy efficiency. However, now we inevitably have to adjust to the climate changes, which hasn't been on the top of priority right now. Here on this slide, you can see some real-time pictures from Belarus. See, here is the climate change happening right now, the drought, the peat bogs, fires, natural fires. We have some extreme fallouts where our storm water sewage cannot just take in all the fallout, and then administrative buildings, business centers are affected, and due to the new pests and diseases, our forests are jeopardized. So we are now planning very first initiatives and action plans for us to go deeper into this, to create better action plan to develop a greener settlements. So here is for flip chart. I'd like to say that it's very important that cities participate in these initiatives, because cities can also exchange experiences and borrow some very good ideas, and it's very important for us to cooperate as businesses with the local authorities, with the federal authorities. Thank you very much for your attention.
Natalia, there was a very good example of one of the international networks that are available for cities of all sizes, as you mentioned, to join in and build the experience together, but also have a very, very strong accounting system where you have to report your data, and you get support and guidance from other cities in the network and from experts, so you don't feel alone, even if you're a city that might be starting on this pathway. So thank you very much. Thank you to the first three speakers as well. Before we move on to our next distinguished speakers, any quick question from the audience? I think we might have time for one quick question right now. We will have a discussion session at the end, but any burning questions? Great. I'll let you think for the discussion session. I just have a very quick one for Ulf Andersson, if that's okay. So you have mentioned the sewage, the waste heat that you are reusing across Sweden and, for example, in Stockholm. But could you just mention 2-3 words about what does need to happen for that to be possible? So do you have to work with the businesses, or do you work with the energy company directly, or what does it actually entail to make that happen?
Well, if you utilize waste heat, you wouldn't have to have both a producer and a consumer of waste heat. So it's always necessary to have some sort of local cooperation between those actors who own the sources of the heat and those who are utilizing it. And in many cases in Sweden, the utilizers are the municipalities who own like housing or places where need heat. And the producers of heat are mostly businesses. So it's mostly a cooperation between businesses and municipalities. And you can have very local solutions that one specific heat source, for instance, a computer center, is heating just one building. Or you could have a citywide system, and that in most cases make it necessary to have some sort of district heating system to make it for an efficient distribution.
Great. Thank you so much. And yeah, I'm sorry we don't have time to delve on this example, but it's just one of the concrete examples where really the solution is there, the technology exists. It's partly a question of finance, but even more a question of managing the structures in the city.
I might add that if you are looking at the European Union, if waste heat was an energy source, it would be the second energy source within the European Union.
Great, thank you. Great. So let's move on to our next speakers, and please do start noting your questions. We will have another time for questions very soon. So it's my pleasure to now invite Tatiana Kabarova to tell us a bit more about some of the UN Habitat projects that you are working on, and specifically how they contribute to the unification of cities, and again, some good examples of collaboration that might have led to more efficiency.
Спасибо большое. Слышно меня? Это нормально. Я рада приветствовать вас от имени программы ООН по населенным пунктам.
Well, I'm very happy to be here and to be able to share with you our UN Habitat program. That's one of the key top priorities on the UN agenda. It's all about sustainable development of the settlements. In the recent years, well, the climate changes and sustainability has been on the city agenda for such a long time now, and cities yet more and more are being affected by the extreme weather conditions and climate change, and now naturally cities account for 70% of the greenhouse gas emissions on a global scale. Having said this, cities consider climate change as their top priority, work with the top priorities, all the goals, all the sustainable goals and targets are set now. Now we also have new urban agenda. This project, this paper has been passed in 2006 at the World Conference on Housing and Sustainable Development, and unfortunately documents like this are only adopted once in, say, a decade, but these are very important initiatives that set the target for us towards we move for the next 20 years. When it comes to the sustainable urban development and climate change, this document covers that the key role here is allocated to the urban designers in high-quality urban design. We've been talking a lot about technological solution, but we really need to see smart city planning, smart urban planning in place in order to have those technologies efficient. It's good to have environmental friendly public transportation, but when it comes to the smart city, you don't need to travel those long distances anymore when you have your house close to where you work, and these are a lot more efficient solutions that really give us a smart city. A very next important point that I'd like to make, which goes all through those new urban development agenda, covers national governments that just inevitably have to make cities adopt measures and standards that are sustainable city development oriented, that are decreased greenhouse gases emissions oriented. That's inevitable. Now I'd like to mention a few initiatives that are being supported by the UN Habitat program. And this is a relatively new initiative, and this covers
It might not be the exact translation, but it is about climate adaptation measures. And this initiative is supported by a number of partner organizations, and they are engaged, including developers, Association of University Schools of Urban Planning, and of course the UN Habitat is also an active player. Here is another initiative, the Global Covenant of Mayors. It was mentioned by a previous speaker from Belarus. Under the aegis of the Global Covenant of Mayors, a number of projects are launched and implemented. Recently, we launched 2 new projects with the partnership in Mozambique. Here is another type of project, low emission projects, where the UN Habitat is also a partner in Indonesia, India, Brazil, Colombia, Bangladesh, Rwanda, and Belarus. In this context, I find it necessary to mention the foundation that was created over 10 years ago in the frame of the Kyoto Protocol. Now it is a vital financial tool for the Paris Agreement. The Adaptation Foundation supports and backs many projects. The Adaptation Fund has been operating in over 80 countries, and last year we supported projects to the tune of $100 million. Here is the next initiative, an international climate-related initiative. It is financed from the German government. It is related to urban development with the Low Carbon Initiative in the context of new urban development programs. Here is another type of initiatives. They are also supported by our organization. They are implemented in one country, but what is important is that 2 agencies pool their resources together, UNEP and UN Habitat. The project was launched in 2012. Strategy, policies, and plan of action were all drafted for Myanmar. The UN Habitat is also an active supporter of scientific research in climate change. Inter alia, a scientific conference was held last March in Canada, which is called Cities and Climate Change. One of our avenue of work is drafting of best practices and preparation of various guidelines. And as was said, these recommendations are not legally binding. Nevertheless, they are actively used both at national and local city level around the globe. Here are City Climate Action Planning Guideline. All these publications are available on the official website. This is it. Thank you.
Jana, especially I would say for bringing in the conversation the resilience and the adaptation, which of course is a very important aspect of what cities need to deal with today. So we are already starting to feel the impacts of the climate change, more urban heat, more flooding or rainfall in certain cities. And that actually brings us nicely to the next speaker, Mark Eisenman, who will share with us some experiences around addressing climate change through food and agriculture policy. So not resilience by itself, but something that actually links the two and has some of the biggest potential to also reduce greenhouse gases. So if we could get the presentation up, technical team, or feel free to start slowly without, if you can, and I'm sure it will come up in a second. And if I could ask all the speakers to try and keep up to 4 or 5 minutes, so you get space for everyone, but thank you.
Здравствуйте.
Good afternoon. Distinguished colleagues, it is a great honor for me to give a speech at this important conference. I would like first of all to thank Moscow administration. Moscow is one of my favorite cities around the globe. 10 years ago, me and my family, we lived here. My wife, Tanya, was born in Moscow. My 2 sons, Sasha and Misha, also do speak Russian. As you see, I'm also learning Russian. Anyway, I ask you to apologize me because I'm going to speak English.
Okay, I'm going to do this in 4 minutes. I'll be speaking briefly today about how cities can work together to address climate change through urban food and ag policy. Agriculture is often overlooked in climate change conversations. When we discuss climate change, I mean, of course, we start on fossil fuels and clean energy, but to fully address the sources of climate change and climate change adaptation, we must concentrate on food and ag. Sorry, I lost my... What is surprising to many people is that food and agriculture is responsible for as much as 25% of worldwide greenhouse gas emissions from human activity. This is as large as electricity and heat as well as industry, but gets much less attention. The good news is that cities are beginning to take the lead on adopting new food policies to reduce climate pollution and at the same time to make the cities healthier and more sustainable. Okay. I'm going to mention 5 quickly policy strategies that cities are taking now to address climate change as well as for health and resiliency reasons. The first strategy is to leverage the huge purchasing power of cities to buy and promote more climate-friendly food. Climate-friendly food primarily means food grown or produced in a way that reduces agricultural emissions in contrast to conventional agricultural practices. The best example are fruits, vegetables, and other plant-based foods. But, and I'll discuss this in about 2 minutes, it can also mean on farms that increase how much carbon is sequestered or stored in the soil. We all know that cities spend a lot of money on their institutions, hospitals, schools, and they can use this huge purchasing power to not only increase the amount of climate-friendly food in the cities, but to also stimulate the market for this food for other private businesses and around the country. Just one quick example, in New York City, where I'm based, the public schools serve 1 million meals per day to students, which is more meals in the United States than any other institution other than the U.S. military. So my organization, Sovet по защите природных ресурсов, helped to create a network in the United States of the largest school districts called the Urban School Food Alliance, made up of New York City, Chicago, LA, and other large cities, to come together to buy sustainable, climate-friendly food. I took this picture, so you can clap for that. This brings me to my second strategy, which is meat. I was surprised when I learned this a couple years ago that global livestock emissions are equal to global transportation-related emissions. It's about 14%. And I'm not suggesting that we boycott meat. I like steak and hamburgers, especially if they're sustainably raised. But what some cities and governments now are doing is seeking modest reductions in meat consumption. Two quick examples. One is sort of Meatless Monday, which is a global movement where cities and businesses and others make a commitment to reduce meat at least on one day. Another example is called the blended burger, where you're blending in mushrooms and other plants into hamburgers without compromising on taste but lowering meat. A third strategy to reduce for cities is to reduce and manage food waste. This was just talked about briefly. Every year we lose about globally one third of all food produced for human consumption is wasted, which is food waste alone is responsible for 8% of worldwide greenhouse gas emissions, 8%. And much of this comes from food that goes into landfills. So what can cities do? First, they can work with large institutions to reduce the amount of food waste in the first place. Second, they can divert excess food waste into food banks, emergency shelters, where low-income folks can't afford as much. And third, they can mandate or create voluntary programs to separate food waste from trash so that it can be easily recycled, either through composting or through anaerobic digestion, which creates biogas, as was just mentioned, or material that can be put back on the farm, like I'm holding here in my hand. Just last week, 23 global cities and regions made a commitment organized by C40 to cut the amount of overall trash generated by each citizen 15% by 2030 and reduce the amount of waste sent to landfills and incinerators by 50%. This is called Advancing Toward Zero Waste Declaration, just announced last week. The Rockefeller Foundation in New York also is funding cities in the United States and regions around the world to address food waste. Almost done. The fourth strategy is increasing urban ag. Urban agriculture was not taken seriously until recently. There was virtually no discussion about it around its potential climate benefits. But in recent years, there's been renewed urban focus both in the United States and elsewhere on urban ag, whether it be small community gardens or very large rooftop hydroponic greenhouses, which you're looking at here, which is grown with water and no soil. They can be huge energy reductions from rooftop vegetation for both heating and cooling. There are other significant climate benefits. For example, you don't have to move the food as far from the farms. And it also provides a source of food during extreme during extreme weather events or where transportation for food may be cut off during climate change. Okay, last point. Is that I'd like to highlight something that's often that I mentioned briefly at the beginning, which is that agricultural activities can change the amount of carbon stored in soils, thus effectively either releasing or causing climate change or absorbing carbon dioxide and mitigating climate change. This is actually another surprising fact that I learned not that long ago, that the largest source of agricultural emissions, which is 50%, half of agricultural emissions in the United States, is how we manage the soil. Soil management includes fertilization, tillage, and irrigation, for example. So climate-friendly farming practices that help absorb CO2, including reducing synthetic fertilizers, reducing or eliminating tillage of the land, increasing the use of so-called cover crops during the off-season in the fall and winter, for example, such as legumes and grasses. So you might be saying, I thought we were at a cities conference. Why is Mark talking about the countryside? Well, it turns out that cities more and more are acting to protect the agricultural areas around them to enhance local food production. One way to think about it is the city's food shed, like you think about a city's watershed. And there are cities now who are developing so-called food shed policies. Some of you might know there was a pact signed by 177 cities called the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact that specifically recognized the importance of cities protecting not only in the core, but also protecting the rural areas around them. So those are the 5 strategies. There's a summary slide. And my last point that I'll make is that even if you're a climate skeptic on the cause of climate change, it doesn't really matter, because everything that I just mentioned will improve the environment, will improve public health, will enhance resilience to climate change, and will increase efficiency and profitability over the long term.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark, and thank you to all the speakers, because we are on a very tight schedule. And to liven it up a little bit, I would like to ask our first 3 speakers, Ulf, Vladimir, and Natalia, if you could kindly take your seat in the first row, and we can invite on stage our last 3 speakers, Gulnara Roll, Stephen Nystrom, again, hopefully the presentation will work this time, and Irina Ilyina. We should have the right nameplates as well, so if you could ask Ulf as well to take seat in the front row, and please join us on stage. And while we do that exchange, let me give you the word now to Timur, who will hopefully in 4 minutes or less, as we started a bit late, give us some insights into what actually relates quite nicely to what Mark was talking about right now around agriculture, some of the impacts of climate change. So let's hear a little bit more about a region that's not necessarily as urban as some of the ones we've talked about so far, but that can bring us some interesting examples as well. So thanks again for 3-4 minute presentation.
Can I please have my presentation? Now, my idea is to take you from the concrete jungle to the mountainous regions and to share with you little stories from Tajikistan. You know, there is such a country. You will find many beautiful mountains in our territory. We rank first in number of greenhouse gas. We are at the bottom of the list in terms of greenhouse gas emissions per capita, but still we are ranked first in terms of vulnerability to climate change. I would like to share with you 3 personal stories that we collected while working in our villages. Here is a man who lives in the village Nisur, in the altitude of 5,000 meters. There is no lighting. The cell coverage has just appeared, and it is still quite problematic. Conditions are quite severe. In 2009, Razika, our friend, built so-called solar-paneled greenhouse. The construction of this greenhouse allows for the citizens to use solar energy, thus extending the planting period, the growing period for plants and vegetables. If before they couldn't grow some plants due to severe cold weather conditions, now they have overcome that obstacle. This greenhouse, between March and December, is used by his family to feed 5 people. Now they can have cucumbers and tomatoes on the table, something they couldn't get before due to weather conditions. And on top of that, they have a nice revenue of $200 to $300 a year, because they can sell these vegetables to their friends and neighbors. So as you can see, this greenhouse also generates revenue. And these greenhouses were built by this man alone. Here is another story, Gurli Sanjit, who lives in the village Ranshot on the altitude of 3,000 meters above the sea level. No lighting there either. They have a small power plant, but it doesn't work smoothly. And all around the village, they use wood, rather bushes, because there are not many trees in the neighborhood. But now they're there are practically no bushes, and it takes 12 or 15 kilometers walk in order to find wood to heat the place. And in 2016, this woman got a very easy device. I think you are familiar with it. In 2017, this Helia kitchen was used very actively, and now members of the family do not need to go and look for wood so often. There is more time to take care of kids, to work home. It is a lower burden on health. Now this kitchen is also open for the neighbors, who from time to time come by asking to boil a kettle or something like that. And 70 kitchens of the kind were distributed in the village.
Он безработный, тоже из села Несура, о котором мы уже говорили.
Well, here's the third story. He's 25 years old. He's been living in the town of Nisur for his entire life, and this settlement has never seen electricity, but in 2009 he participated in a contest that really motivated him to start working in the energy sector. He also graduated as the hydro engineer later, and then he came back to
Старый генератор они сняли с небольшого ветряка, еще и так далее. Сейчас они, и таким самым образом они частично сейчас обеспечили светом часть домохозяйств в селе. Сейчас он думает о том, чтобы построить 5-киловаттную ГЭС в этом селе, и при этом активно участвует в жизни местной общественной организации. Некоторые выводы. Первое, что я хотел бы сказать, что очень простые и доступные технологии, недорогие технологии, очень часто на самом деле могут менять.
So there are a lot of available technologies and very cheap technologies, and it's not necessarily you need to really chase expensive cutting-edge technologies. We really need to reshape the way we're thinking, and this applies both to big cities and smaller towns. We cannot be thinking anymore about us never trying again after we failed first, and it's very important to have pilot projects and say for the purpose of demonstration of setting an example, and these should be financed. And it's very important to also develop work on the local potential, say the people. So now I would like to also welcome you to visit my home country. Not necessarily all of the stories that we have are success stories, but these are attempts. No one succeeds without trying, so you're very welcome to Tajikistan.
And these were really some absolutely really much appreciate that that was exactly on time, and this is a great segue actually to remarks by Stefan. And what made me think about it is that he was mentioning in the plenary session this morning how he installed solar panels on his own house and how he's taking concrete action himself. So of course some of the stories we just heard from Timur were in a little bit of a different setup, but still there's so much potential that individuals or small communities can also do. So Stefan, over to you for your remarks, and really sorry about the timing, but thank you for keeping the time.
I'll try and do that. Let's see if this one works first. Yes, it does. Let's see if the presentation is here now. It just might be.
Do we have Stefan's presentation, please, technical team?
Well, while we wait, we can also speak about meat consumption and what Mark said before. I measured actually my meat consumption as well. And during the last 15 years, I like meat as well, you know. Who doesn't like a good steak? But then again, how much do you need to eat? So instead of having 200 grams per time, you're good off with 100 grams, and then you actually get much better health as well. So as you said, there is a no regrets policy over that. So I'm not going to speak very much about cities, but rather about where are we at in the world at the moment. And these curves signify how we behaved against Mother Earth during the last 50 years, or actually a couple of hundred years. They represent how much we emit in terms of sulfur dioxide, carbon dioxide, how much material we use, how fast we extinct species, just anything you'd like. And you can look more when you have more time, if you would like, into the Great Acceleration, which is in a book, by the way, which can be bought from a Swedish professor at the Swedish Environmental Institute. But nevertheless, we have to cut these hockey sticks, and we just have no option. Because, you know, this is not about biological species surviving. This is about us having an earth to live on and a place to be for future generations. Or as Christine Lagarde put it, the former finance minister of France, we will manage to sit in this room at the moment, but future generations will be cooked, smoked and fried if we don't manage. And we're above 400 ppm already, in an already increased temperature on Earth by more than 1 degree. And what's going to happen if we continue is about this scenario, which can be looked into at the IPCC homepage. Up to the left is what's going to happen in 2050, 2060 if we continue emitting CO2 emissions like we do today. We're looking at a world which may become 3 to 4 to 5 degrees warmer. It's going to be impossible to live around the Mediterranean, for instance, because it's going to be above 50 degrees on a daily basis from like April to September in Portugal, Croatia, Italy, many places. And up to the right, you can see what's going to happen with food production. Warmer colors, more difficult to produce food. Colder colors, green and blue and so forth, a little bit easier perhaps, because it depends on when the rains come and how they come. And down to the lowest, you can see the increase in population that the United Nations is expecting in 2015. We'll go from 7.3 billion people now until 9.7 billion in 2050. And as it said in the invitation, you know, urbanization is also going to increase from 50% today up to 80% in 2050. That means we're going to have to build, literally speaking, 1 million cities each second, third day for the coming 32 days. And if we continue to build those in cement and steel and the way we do today, we just won't manage the Paris Agreement's goals. End of story. This is why the World Economic Forum does not look at, I mean, this is not an environmental issue if anyone thought it was. It's a matter of national security, it's a matter of world security, it's a matter of food security, it's a geopolitical issue which needs to be tackled by governments and by prime ministers, and that's why all prime ministers agreed to the Paris Agreement. It was not for environmental reasons solely. This is failure of climate change, mitigation and adaptation, topping the global risk report of 2016, equaling weapons of mass destruction if we don't manage climate change, just so we know where we're at and what the stakes are. In Sweden, we have just presented a new climate law, and we're going to have zero emissions till 2045, and 87% of the Swedish Riksdag, the Duma or whatever, the national parliament, stands firmly behind it. 87%. I think that's fairly good. And I call upon you all to look into this law and see if there's anything in it for you, because it gives a solid framework, long-term conditions and investment conditions for private businesses to know where they need to be in 2045. And this is when they need to be, and this is where everyone needs to be. We spoke about it a little bit this morning for those of you who attended the morning session. We will go electric, and then again we will go electric, and it's going to be renewable energies that dominate the world. And those who don't go for this, they will be left behind, because it's becoming so cheap. Solar is now the absolutely cheapest way of producing new energy, or at least electricity, in at least half of the countries in the world. And as I said to somebody, to those of you who listened this morning, also like in Moscow and in Sweden, it's very profitable for individuals and for companies to put up solar panels on their roofs now. And you know, in Sweden we're experts at tricky rules for how you can construct buildings. We need to have 240 in the roof, and there are no thresholds, so we can move wheelchairs in and out, toilet to the left. But then again, new standards for buildings that you need to produce energy could perhaps be a good idea, And this is how the Swedish real GDP and CO2 emissions have decoupled during the last years. I won't go further into that. Some people complain about all that money that goes into renewables. What a waste. Not at all. They are the reason why we have so cheap solar panels and why it's so cheap with wind power these days. Because when you double production, running costs go down 20%. And when you double that production, that cost go down by 20%. It's the law of solar. It applies anywhere and everywhere. And 5 times as much goes into subsidies for fossil fuels. If you have any, think about removing them. Think about building in wood. Think about planning. Cars take us anywhere and nowhere if we don't plan. And 4 more short pictures. This is an example from New York and how fast it can be. Ford asked New Yorkers, you went around by that tarmac, but perhaps some of your forefathers, what do you want for transportation means? And the New Yorkers answered, faster horses. Wise answer or not? 13 years later, where's the horse? And this is generally how it works, Hands up, who wants change? In all elections, everybody wants change. But then again, who wants to change? So it's a matter of what you said, Mrs. Moderator, before. It's a matter of how we organize our societies and how we build our morale and how we build our ethics. It's not about technique. The technique is always with us. The economy is almost there in most areas, as Mark pointed out earlier on. It's a matter of, do we really want to change? That's up to each and every one of us. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Stefan. And leaving us with this quite an ambitious picture to try and get to, but of course also something that we will unavoidably and for our better benefit as well achieve at some point. So if we have our technical team online, I'd like to now invite Irina to give us a very, very short remarks about some additional climate change challenges before we finish the session in a couple of minutes with Gulnara. They will give us a bit of a summary and share some of the sustainability solutions for cities and development for climate neutrality. So, let's start.
Well, good afternoon, dear colleagues. Unfortunately, we do not have enough time for me to present my talk in full scale. I just like to make one point. So whenever we work on urban planning, we need to also forecast for the future. We need to have our future in mind because every city planning process, it's a continuous unstoppable process. So whenever we're talking about smart cities, sustainable cities, a resilient city, we really need to be able to forecast for 30 years to come. In Moscow, which is today and tomorrow hosting this climate forum, has been addressing those issues for quite a while now. I used to be a part of the city urban planning team in Moscow for some time ago, and we've been thinking about what we want Moscow to be like. Maybe we haven't really considered climate changes back then, but we've been talking about implying hydrodynamic tubes and pipelines so that city has fresh air circulation. And the urban planning that we have right now, it's actually very environmentally justified. In those green areas, that some of them are not here anymore, that have been first created in order to have a resident-friendly environment in the city of Moscow. Now we know that Moscow has grown. It has new areas adjacent to it from the southwestern part. And what was the reason to do so? Well, it wasn't that developed in terms of housing, and it would add additional fresh air circulation to the city. So taken into account climate changes that we have, that we first see in the bigger cities, we really have to be very careful about our future city urban design, urban planning. And Moscow is acting right now as an example, role model that really gives us hope that our future is going to be optimistic, is going to be positive. So we used to have city planning standards back in the Soviet Union, but these need adjustment, and we only hope that we will address it. And this is it from me right now, but I really hope that climate changes are on top of the agenda when we're working on the city planning.
Thank you so much for the remarks, and also a very good final words before we hear the final remarks. And I was just about to point out that luckily we've got the presentation already ready for Gulnara, but it just disappeared. So if you wouldn't mind starting perhaps with a quick introduction while technical team brings the slides back up. Thank you so much.
Well, while my presentation is being prepared, I'd like to start with expressing my gratitude to the Moscow government for this opportunity to speak here. Well, this session is a very interesting one, and I believe that it's only for me to draw some concluding points, maybe. Well, first, my name is Gurala Rol. I am the head of Housing and Land Management Unit in the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, headquartered in Geneva. So we belong to the UN, and I work together with Tatiana Khabarova in the UN Habitat Program, and UN institutions are now working closely together. And I really very much like this idea of having mandatory multilateral agreements such as 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development and the Paris Agreement. I believe that these have overall importance, and mandatory agreements are sometimes treated by the countries reluctant because they are unlikely to sign up for something they can really promise they achieve. But when it comes to a free will agreement and goodwill agreement, then countries are more positive about participating in those. And this is what we see both in the European Commission and the United Nations. And we can see that some countries are naturally more proactive or less proactive, just like Moscow, which basically takes the initiative of putting together this forum. So it's very important to sign the multilateral agreements, say coordination, management, and arranging this process running simultaneously, continuously at all levels. Say countries, they can sign this 2030 agenda or the city agenda, but if it doesn't go down to the action plan, if it does not get spread across the business community, across the local authorities, this is not just delivered. So local coordination is very important, and horizontal coordination is very important between business community, between NGOs and media. when it, just like our colleague from Tajikistan has just said, that we really need to work on the local potential. We need to work both locally and on the national level, and that's very important for us to see. And we've got huge load of work ahead of us because with all those very important international agreements and the Paris Agreement, and we have so many more new approaches, and we have so many new approaches to the high technology use, and these are not necessarily being translated into applicable skills. So I believe that there should be at least one project on which we should really work on. We should probably create a library or a catalog of the best available practices, or maybe online trainings, courses. In the UN, we also work on the Climate Smart City Index. We've already transferred the index from the national level to the local level, and I just like to go back to the speaker from Tajikistan and make a reference. We really need to work on the methods, on the research methods that are so much important to have in place. And this all of this requires resources and cooperation between the countries, between the organization. And we in the European Economic Commission, even though we're based in Geneva, we are very open to cooperation. We're going to have our Urban Week, October 1st till October 7th, and you're very welcome to visit, and we're looking at cooperating very closely.
Thank you very much, Gulnara. So sorry for the slides that didn't show up, and thank you so much to all the speakers and to the audience. We have started a little bit late, so finished a little bit late, but we have heard from 9 amazing speakers who I'm sure are available for any questions after the session. And we also have a representative from the municipality of Rome here. So if you'd like to ask any questions later, feel free to as well. But thank you again to all the speakers, and have a nice afternoon.